This is the 16th Annual Economic Summit, and I've been to them all, and they've all had great panels, and I'm sure that this panel is going to live up to that standard as well. We heard a lot of great things this morning and all day, and every single one of them had something that touched on antitrust and competition policy, which made a great lineup for that. Antitrust has been in the news lately, both in the US and around the world, including this morning. While we were sitting here, Senator Warren made an announcement about what kinds of antitrust policies she would enact as if she were elected. So there's been a lot of focus currently on merger enforcement and concentration and the potential misuse of market power. Such concerns are not new. And so I thought it would be useful to put in a little bit of historical perspective about the role of economics in antitrust, given that we're at SIEPR, and before our panelists come up and talk. So competition policy has gone through a lot of swings in importance in this country, starting in 1890 with the passage of the Sherman Act. Don't worry, I'm not going to go year by year. Then we had actually a promotion of consolidation during the Great Depression because there was a worry about firms going bankrupt and they needed to be able to raise prices. And then we went to more of a big is bad philosophy in the 1960s and early 1970s. But in the 1970s, the tide shifted, not only with the rise of the Chicago School of Antitrust, but also in deregulation with, for example, the deregulation of the airlines in the Carter administration. A more economic approach to competition policy continued as economic theory and evidence was used in competition cases and in competition rulings and filings. Not only the Chicago School, but also challenges to the Chicago School when the underlying assumptions didn't hold. Over the same time, European enforcers also incorporated more economics. Most people here probably had their views of EU antitrust enforcement colored by the rejection of the GE-Honeywell merger in 2001. That was 18 years ago. The press reports cemented the idea that the EU was protecting EU companies. However, mostly since then, the EU enforcement has not taken such an approach. Essentially, EU enforcers use similar tools as those in the US, but with somewhat different presumptions and legal standards. That leads them to somewhat more aggressive antitrust enforcement. But again, recently, not this morning like Senator Warren, but 2.5 weeks ago, so a long time ago, the tide was shifting as the governments of France and Germany were pushing the EU to use enforcement strategically to promote their domestic companies. With the rise of the internet in the mid-1990s, there were calls for a need to revisit antitrust, that it moved too slowly for new technology, and that it was ill-suited to the massive economies of scale and that antitrust enforcement would frustrate innovation because it was backward-looking. But we still use similar, with somewhat modified merger guidelines that seem to apply to high technology as well. And if you read the news, it seems like we've got a new call regarding the idea of revamping competition policy in the technology age. There have been calls for breaking up internet giants, calls for using antitrust to protect privacy, and calls to rethink predatory pricing rules. So now the calls are not that antitrust enforcement is too slow to recognize epochal changes in Schumpeterian competition in the technology industry, but it's not restraining the big companies enough. So this is kind of how do we think about all the different ways in which antitrust affects the economy. So what I want to do now is get started with a short and not sufficient introduction of our two panelists, since you have their impressive bios in your packet. Carl Shapiro, who's closest to me, is professor of business and economics at UC Berkeley and twice held the position of Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Economics at the Antitrust Division. That's a long-winded way of saying he was the chief economist of the Antitrust Division. He also served for a year as a member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, and he's frequently served as an expert witness and advisor to the DOJ, FTC, state attorneys general, and private companies in a wide range of competition issues. Carl is a co-author with Hal Varian, who I think is somewhere here today, of a very influential book called Information Rules that explains a lot about the intersection of antitrust and technology. I think it's ready for an update, but even the principles that it puts forth are still very applicable today. As for our second speaker, I expect by the end of this session you will not make the same mistake that Nick Clegg, who is Facebook's new communication and policy chief in charge with EU relations, did when he recently said, "I don't know who this chap is." in response to a tweet from Tommaso Valletti. Tommaso is the chief competition economist of the EU and a professor of economics at Imperial College Business School, and also a professor of economics at the University of Rome, although he promised me he wouldn't hold forth on Italian bonds. He's a member of the panel of academic advisors to Ofcom, which is the UK communications regulator, and was a member of the panel of academic advisors of the UK Competition Commission. He's a competition policy insider who's willing to share his opinions here with us today, as well as frequently on Twitter if you want to see what he has to say and think on a lot of different issues. So it's great that we have issues, since technology, platforms, and competition are all global. It's great that we have people from the two areas where antitrust is probably most important. And I think, though, their talks are going to be what I would call location agnostic. They're going to talk more about principles, but we may ask how those ideas and applications may differ between the US and EU. So with that, Carl, you ready to talk?
Thanks a lot, Greg. It's a real pleasure to be here. And as a professor from UC Berkeley, I love to come down to Stanford. The first time I came here, I was an undergraduate at MIT, and one of my great high school friends was here, which was also an undergraduate. We finished classes, it was May in MIT, and we're still going on here at Stanford because you have a quarter system. I came here, the flowers were blooming, the women were beautiful. You know, I was 19, I'm allowed to say that back then in the 1970s. And I fell in love with the place, and I ended up pretty close at Berkeley. I've visited Stanford a couple times, so it's a great pleasure to be here. So my topic today, antitrust in a time of populism. What I want to do is give a sort of a broader perspective on what's going on with antitrust and competition policy and some of the forces that and what we're hearing about, and then particularize it more to the tech sector and the tech platforms in particular. So you can see this is the 21st century version of scary big companies. Here is the 19th century, early 20th century version. Maybe a little hard to read, but this is back in the days of the Sherman Act with the trusts. That's where antitrust comes from, right? These were trusts formed, the steel trust, the copper trust. They're all there, controlling the Senate. So it was very much about corruption and corporate power. You may remember, some of you are a little too young for this, but I can remember Teddy Roosevelt going after those guys. I was a young boy back then. But in fact, it's a lot of the same forces. My point is, again, not to walk through the history so much, but it's concerns about corruption, excessive power, political power, and economic power of large corporations, and we're seeing that today. So I have a series of slides just to illustrate very quickly what we're hearing, and a lot of people, I mean, it's not just Elizabeth Warren, right? So, this is kind of a not, I don't think it really works, by the way, like they're not fat and they don't wear those hats anymore, but you get the idea. Here's the early, again, from 100 years ago. This says Standard Oil, in case you can't read it, but, taking over, and Standard Oil, the strategy was, it was a lot of acquisitions, right? That's how these trusts were formed. Well, of course, this is the current version, right? You may recognize Jeff Bezos there. So again, this notion, these companies getting bigger and swallowing things up, right? The Economist, which I love the Economist magazine, they've been very, I would say, aggressive in this. A number of my slides here from the Economist. This sort of the notion there's an empire, and there's kind of this is almost, obviously a high-tech version. And this is their pitch. They've been saying this for the last 2 or 3 years, that these large companies, they have so much power that it's a real problem, not just to economics, but to capitalism, if you will. The legitimacy of capitalism. And you could link that together with inequality and what we've heard from Piketty and so forth. So this is a theme that's really come up. And then they had a special issue a while ago on the tech firms particularly. More recently, they had a very nice special issue just a few months ago. Economist again. And the notion these powerful firms, they're getting more powerful, and it's really worrisome. And part of that theme is somehow antitrust is supposed to solve this problem, and the people have been asleep at the switch, or it's inadequate. Okay. Now to get to Elizabeth Warren, so this is from a year or so ago. So you can see this is her rhetoric, right? In every corner of our economy, big, powerful corporations are killing off competition. She mentions a bunch of sectors and basically alarming control, okay? And as Greg mentioned, just today, I guess, or yesterday, she came out with a rather detailed plan about breaking up some of the big tech firms. We'll talk about that a little more. So just to frame what was going on then, for somebody who's been doing antitrust a long time, so like 20 years ago, Microsoft was the big issue, and there was a major case against them. 40 years ago, it was AT&T and IBM, you know, even within living memory, without going back to Standard Oil. And it's always, first off, there's always economies of scale underneath this, okay? These companies are big because they're economies of scale. Today and a century ago, there are these populist aspects where people look to antitrust as the solution, even when I'm going to argue, don't expect too much from antitrust, basically, okay? Inequality problems, antitrust is unlikely to be able to solve that. Consumer protection and privacy issues are very much what people are talking about with the big tech firms. Those are not inherently what antitrust is about competition, right? It's monopoly and competition. There's corruption and political influence. So I think one just needs to frame this as what can we reasonably expect? So I'm going to use the word antitrust. In Europe, they talk about competition policy as their word for it. And there's really two big areas then that this part of the law and this part of public policy can legitimately address, at least with current tools, and that the way the economists who study this look at. One is mergers and acquisitions, okay? We have the Clayton Act, which dates to 1914, which is a strong statute, was strengthened in 1950 to control mergers and acquisitions that may substantially lessen competition. It's about competition, okay? And then the other is really the Sherman Act, 1890, as you've heard, which is about business practices. The word would be monopolization. I actually prefer the European term, abuse of a dominant position. It's basically a firm that's powerful that's not playing fair in some sense. Okay, whatever that means, we have to define that, and the courts have worked on that for 125 years. But those are the two areas where we can look to antitrust to do something. Okay. I should distinguish antitrust from regulation. Okay, regulation, you know, such as telecom regulation or in its day airline regulation, rate of return regulation, that is not antitrust. That is, we've given up on competition, or the competition isn't working right, so we have to come in and have regulators, you know, control your prices or determine how you run your business in some way. The FCC does this in a bunch of ways for the communications sector. And it's not necessarily a happy story all along, but that is different from antitrust, which is trying to keep markets competitive through these two areas, mergers on the one hand and business practices on another. Okay, so I want to then, again, kind of fairly quickly go through, not getting to the tech firms yet, there's really two big things that we've heard about a lot, and economists are working on quite actively. One is consolidation. You know, we have markets becoming more concentrated, and the other is high profits, which would be worrisome that there's something wrong with the competition. The competition isn't working right if the profits are high and persistent. And, okay, so Economist has some nice stuff on this. There's other academic work, but I don't really expect you to read this, but this is a diagram showing concentration in 1997 versus 2012, so a change. So anything that's on the upper left here, those are by industry or sector. So it's true that when we look at the Census Bureau data, which is kind of the best data we've got across the whole economy, we do see some increases in concentration. This is measuring the four-firm concentration ratio, that is the market share of the top four firms. And you can look at different sectors and markets, and it's definitely true that the larger firms are picking up more share, okay, in general. You know, there's all sorts of variation, of course. So that's true. And the economists measured this using, I think, a perfectly sensible way. I highlighted in the red here all sectors. The way to think about it, if you had a single number, it would be the four-firm concentration ratio on average has gone from about 25% to about 30%. So the top four firms, instead of controlling a market, maybe it's 25, used to be 25%, now it's 30%. Okay, now it's a single number. It's not going to ever summarize all these things. And a lot of press has said, well, that's increased concentration, that's a big problem. As an industrial organization, antitrust person, I'm like, wait a moment, the top four firms controlling 30% of the market, it doesn't sound like anywhere near a monopoly. It's not even a very tight oligopoly. Is that something really we're supposed to get all bent out of shape about? You know, in our field we would say no, but you know, are we missing something? Okay. So I think the big question here is when we see these modest increases in concentration, do we think it's some sort of breakdown in competition, as a number of people are saying, such as Senator Warren, or do we think that actually it's not that big a deal in terms of concentration, and if anything, it reflects economies of scale, larger firms, maybe more efficient firms are picking up share. Maybe it has to do with globalization, information technology, okay, that's increased scale economies, okay. Now I tend to lean in that camp, but my main point here is simply a lot of what you read is really looking at moderate increases in concentration and reading way too much into that, both in terms of what's causing it and whether it's really a problem. The other thing are profits. I happen to like this diagram. I want to be the guy at the top, by the way. You know, if we're capitalists, we say, hey, profits, that's great. That's, you know, you're supposed to compete, try to earn profits. If you're successful, you earn profits. But can they be too high? What if they last a long time? So I just looked at some of the Census Bureau data again. And this is corporate profits as a share of GDP. And roughly speaking, over a period of, let's say, 30 years, gone up from 7 to 11, from 7 to percent of GDP to 11 or 12%, okay? Now, like any of these measures, it's accounting stuff, it's not gonna be perfect, but I think it is true that corporate profits, and this is before the tax cuts, right? Have gone up, and that's a 50% increase, right? If you go from 7% to 11.5% of GDP. So that's, as a competition person, I'm like, well, that's interesting. What's going on with that, okay? Now, some of it's exports and globalization. I looked by sector, and you can see manufacturing. This is the share of domestic profits, just sort of where's the profits being made. And manufacturing, not surprisingly, has gone down a lot. The manufacturing share of GDP has gone down, and we know manufacturing industries generally faced a lot of pressure from imports. Finance and insurance has done pretty well in terms of the share of profits. Information, which is this broad sector that would include tech, has gone up some, okay, too. But anyhow, that's kind of a hint about what's going on, kind of finance and insurance, not so much tech maybe. But it does raise this question. There's some evidence that the profits are skewed, just like we talk about a skewed distribution of income, that the very top firms are earning a bigger share of the profits. There's evidence of what's called declining business dynamism. It's harder, fewer startups. Maybe that's part of the story, okay? I think there's some questions here, and I'm not answering these things. I think these are ongoing research questions. Why did corporate profits grow so much as a share of GDP? How persistent are they at a firm level? If the profits just move around from one firm to another, that sounds like competition. If a set of firms keeps making profits over and over again, that's more suggestive they've got sort of entrenched position we should worry about. And it's somehow more difficult to break into new markets, okay? So, there is this interpretation you hear generally about how, again, Senator Warren and, again, a lot of publications, other politicians, there's a whole little industry in DC, turning this stuff out now, declining competition, inadequate antitrust enforcement. And this story would be, we've allowed too many mergers, it's harder to get into new markets, these big firms are stomping out competition. Certainly Senator Warren uses that language. And the tech sector, maybe especially so in that, they've got these enormous market caps and valuation, right? And that this is, if you want to continue that story, some people say that's kind of all that market power, less dynamic. That's part of the productivity problem overall and part of the inequality problem. So that would be one story, looking to antitrust to do a hell of a lot to solve that. A contrary interpretation, and I'm more in this camp, although I think the evidence is still coming in, and I should say, you shouldn't generalize, I was going to say in general, that would be a bad statement. You shouldn't generalize because so many different sectors are different. But there are growing economies of scale, globalization, information technology. There's great work, fantastic work showing that, including by people here like Nick Bloom, showing that the most efficient firms in an industry are way more efficient than the other firms, and that tends to persist, so they call them superstar firms. Often we have consolidation. We have national firms taking over and competing against regional firms. Like Walmart did that in its day. To some extent, Amazon's doing that now. And so we have the contrary interpretation is this is the competitive process at work, these superstar firms. So yeah, they're getting a bigger market share, they're making a lot of profits, and it's sort of hard for other firms to replicate that. That's why the profits are durable. And that's not a breakdown of competition, it is a manifestation and reflection of competition. Okay, like I said, it's not going to be the same story in different markets. There are a lot of markets where I think we have serious market power problems. A lot of healthcare markets such as hospitals, airlines, we probably have allowed too many mergers. You know, I could go on with the list too, okay? But when you get these broad generalizations, I think it's going to be dangerous. Okay, so what are the implications then for more in the tech sector in particular? So first, I've showed this as, you know, this is the hoovering up image, right, for the tech firms. I would say, you know, let's talk about the two areas of antitrust, and now I'm going to slow down a little bit to say, well, what does it really mean? What should we be doing in antitrust? What are we not doing? So let's talk about, there's mergers and acquisitions, and then the conduct of large, powerful firms. So the mergers and acquisitions, you know, there's this notion they're sucking everything up, okay? So, and Tommaso's going to talk about this more, acquisitions by the tech firms, and so I'll touch on it lightly. But so first off, it's probably true if you just look at the big tech firms, most of the growth's organic, really. I mean, you know, largely. I mean, yeah, Google's had a couple hundred acquisitions, but you know, their primary profit engine and their revenue engine is their search, which is, you know, not fundamentally based on acquisitions. Okay. Now you could talk about YouTube at one point or DoubleClick. So there are elements there that are okay. Apple's, you know, even more organic growth. Facebook less so. Okay, so there's what you want to look. Each company, what have they actually done by way of acquisitions? How important is it to their business strategy? And the other thing here is you really don't want to lump these. You know, take the four companies that, by the way, Elizabeth Warren wants to break all of them up according to her proposal. I mean, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, and Google. Those four. You know, the sort of obvious tech titans we talk about. As an antitrust person, you can't just lump them together. They're completely different companies, completely different markets, rather different business models. Yeah, okay, Google and Facebook are sort of similar because they've got an advertising-based model, but that's not at all true for Amazon, obviously. Apple's a different story. So you really got to roll up your sleeves and look market by market and how important are the acquisitions, okay? So I think if you just apply traditional antitrust doctrine, we would say mergers that may substantially lessen competition are illegal and would be investigated typically by the DOJ or the FTC. But when a company expands into a new area, take Amazon Whole Foods. Actually, she says in her thing she would unwind that actually. That's what she says. That's clear. That sailed right through the Federal Trade Commission review. What was it, about a year ago, year and a half or something? Why was that? Why didn't they look at it? Well, they didn't look at it because Amazon wasn't a serious player, if at all, in supermarkets or organic supermarkets or whatever. The FTC challenged the Whole Food Wild Oats merger a while ago because they were direct competitors, and that went to court. But Amazon, this was an extension into a new area, basically. And so the FTC just didn't see a problem. That would be fairly traditional. Now, Facebook, you know, buying WhatsApp is a different story. Okay, that raised a lot more antitrust eyebrows. Point is, you can't just sweep all these things together. I think we're going to continue to see a lot of action, whether to do more in this area on both sides of the Atlantic. Okay, my other slide on this, you know, there they are, the big tech firms looking at these little bugs who I guess are entrepreneurs. Who look like they're tasty, I guess, you know, with the net there. They don't quite look like butterflies. So there's always going to be this fundamental. We've had these potential competition issues for a long time, right? The pharmaceutical industry is actually an interesting example. What happens if a drug company with a blockbuster drug wants to buy up another drug that's in trials, for example, that might come and threaten them? Okay, that FTC has been concerned about that traditionally. You're always going to get this trade-off. Well, are they buying them up? You know, take Google and YouTube, for example. Okay, was that Google buying up a major threat that could have grown into a competing platform, however you want to imagine it? This is what, 10 years ago, 12 years ago or something? Or was it Google buying one of several places that had these videos online, and they invested a huge amount of money into it and grew it dramatically, and that's why it's so successful now. Okay, so those are going to be hard things to do. I think we can totally do that within the existing framework of what we've got antitrust now. The other thing are the big firms, are they erecting barriers to entry? Are they engaging in conduct that is abusive? Google has got into a lot of trouble in Europe on this, but the US is definitely not as aggressive in this area, okay? Our Sherman Act is not either being read by the courts or enforced nearly as aggressively as what the Europeans are doing. That's why a lot of the action in this area is in Brussels, not Washington, D.C. This gets into big data suggested here in this particular image. I'm going to just skip over this and say those are real issues. Under U.S. law as it has developed under the Supreme Court over the last 40 years, the Sherman Act has definitely been shrunken in this area, and it's very hard, much harder than it used to be for the government to win these cases. Now, whether that's right or wrong is a complicated debate. I just tell people, look, if you think one of these companies is horrible, doing something wrong, just tell me specifically what it is, and we can look at it. And that's what I'm used to doing as an antitrust person. Or when I was at DOJ, you investigate, you look at this. Is there business justification? What are the effects? So I just think it's not, the fact they're big and powerful is not the answer. The question is, what did they do? And on that point, let me actually take a moment, go back. This is 1945. This is a very nice quote from Judge Learned Hand. I'm just going to read it, even though it's on the screen, because his prose is so good, and it's a warning for today. The case was Alcoa, United States versus Alcoa. At that time, that was aluminum, post-World War II aluminum, and they arguably had a monopoly or a very strong position in aluminum, and they were challenged by the United States government. And here's what Learned Hand said. A single producer may be the survivor out of a group of active competitors merely by virtue of his superior skill, foresight, and industry. And that's language that's got picked up repeatedly in subsequent cases. In such cases, a strong argument can be made that although the result may expose the public to the evils of monopoly, the Act, referring to the Sherman Act, does not mean to condemn the result of those very forces, which is its prime object to foster. Finis opus coronat. Now that's a little puzzle for you. Check your Latin, figure out what that means. I'll give you a hint, coronat, that's supposed to be a good hint. The successful competitor, having been urged to compete, must not be turned upon when he wins. So that is a core principle. Our antitrust approach is not to say if you get to be big enough or powerful enough or a monopoly that you've somehow broken the law, or that we're going to break you up for that matter. Actually, we're encouraging companies to compete, and if they're very successful, they may obtain that position, okay? And the law then says, look, we're going to look for something you did wrong. If you had conduct that was anti-competitive, then we're going to come after you, and all sorts of bad things could happen. We could tell you to stop doing that. We could even break you up. That's what happened to AT&T in early 80s. So point is, the statute condemns monopolization, some conduct, not having a monopoly, and certainly not being large. Now, maybe this populist time there will be tendencies to depart from that. I don't think that actually that is going to fly very well in the United States. We will see. Okay, so to close, we are in a time of populism. When I think about antitrust and competition, there's kind of dangers in both directions. On the fake side is people who give lip service to, oh, these big companies are terrible, but then actually don't really do anything about it. And I have to say, so far, the Justice Department, the last couple of years, has been taking a lot of positions that are actually shrinking back antitrust, not pushing it forward in amicus briefs. And we don't have any really strong antitrust enforcement action in Sherman Act that we can point to yet. The dangers of the real populism is to be asking antitrust to solve problems that it can't solve. Inequality, the fact that there are large companies that are successful, that are powerful, that may be efficient. We really, if we ask antitrust to solve that, we're asking too much. Privacy issues. Some of that may require regulation. I think we are going to see regulation. I think we need regulation in a bunch of areas. But it's really not about competition, not about antitrust. It's specific areas, and that's what we'll see whether Congress wants to move in that direction. So So I'm urging caution. There's more we could do with antitrust. I should say the courts, particularly the Supreme Court, are pretty hostile to going after big firms in their conduct, particularly the newest two members of the court. And they had a decision last year in American Express that's very favorable to big companies and big tech companies in particular. So we may need legislation if we want to do more with antitrust, but we should not try to solve problems well beyond competition. Thanks. Oh, my friend and colleague, come, Tommaso. This guy is a great chief economist at the EU. I didn't know him that well before, but we've been getting time with him since. Europe.
Thank you very much. And in fact, I'm going to disagree with everything you just said. Now, good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. A common theme this morning was about not having enough optimism in the room. And coming from Europe, from the other side of the Atlantic, actually, I feel very good vibrations here, a lot of optimism. Every time I come to the US, in general, but in California, in Silicon Valley in particular, if I ask somebody, how are you doing today? The answer would be, I'm doing great, I'm doing awesome. Instead, if I ask the same question in London, when I am actually based, the answer would be at best, not too bad. So please, do take this into account when you're going to hear what I'm going to say next. Take into account cultural differences. That's where I come from. I come from Europe. So my general message is, contrary perhaps to what Carl has said, is that we do have selected big problems with a few big platforms in the digital tech area, and I also disagree when it's a bit complacent when it's saying that we don't have an antitrust problem. I think part of it is due to the fact that we are under-enforcing in some selected areas, and so it is part of not having done a good enough job. Okay, this is a very bold statement. I will of course elaborate on that in my next 15-20 minutes. So first of all, the economics of it. So 1999 was when Carl and Hal they wrote the great book Information Rules. 1999 is also when I got my PhD and I started doing research in this kind of area. And that at that time, as an industrial economist, I thought that we were going to have the nirvana of competition. These markets would be markets where we would be multi-home across different platforms. We'll be hopping in a seamless way from one platform to the next. There would be no switching costs. There would be rational searchers always looking for the best possible deals. Transaction costs wouldn't exist. There would be free entry and exit. You get at least dynamically very close to what an economist would call perfectly competitive markets. So, and then we would be very happy. Now, when it comes to a few big techs, and now 20 years later, we are not there. Okay, we are not there, and some of us have been caught by surprise also. So we basically use one social network. We do our searches only on one search engine, and we use one or few marketplaces. And what's important is that there are entry costs. Of course, these companies are spending a lot of money. The concentration levels of those few selected companies are super high. The margin high, the switching costs are pretty high, whether they are physical switching costs or psychological. There's lots of behavioral inertia in this market. So you are not a representative audience, but most of us actually do not change the defaults of our phones, and our phone manufacturers, they get inducements from some of these companies. So there is this combination, business models with zero prices on one side, and then you create externalities on the other side. So the combination of concentration, high margins, difficulty of entry for new firms, behavioral biases, externalities. That means these are markets that, as an economist, I would say, the market is going to fail, even if these markets were actually competitive. So these markets are plagued with this kind of externalities and market failures, and therefore, whether it is regulation or exposed to antitrust intervention, some sort of intervention is warranted, knowing that there can be also regulatory failures, of course. So it's not surprising that we are looking at those markets these days. And when I'm talking a few selected platforms, I have in mind Facebook, I have in mind Google. Amazon is a different kind of beast, okay? But these are the three big platforms nowadays we are concerned with. So, of course, these firms grow very big. the size of the dimension of the problem is also interesting. So if you take the whole population of the United States and then add the whole population of the European Union, which is actually larger than the United States, you multiply by a factor of 3, and here you have the subscriber base of Google. You have how many people of Facebook. That gives you a magnitude of a dimension which is a little bit unprecedented, which tells you also it's very difficult to intervene unless there is some sort of international cooperation, because not single jurisdiction is big enough compared to those companies. And of course, those companies became big, as Carl explained, because they're good. Okay, there's nothing wrong with being big per se. And organic growth is something you don't want to affect, you don't want to intervene, and you should not intervene there. However, some of this growth also came through acquisitions. Acquisitions is potentially a problem, and I will tell you why. There is a very interesting academic paper that is circulating these days, which is called Killer Merger, Killer Acquisition. This is done by people at Yale School of Management and the London Business School. This paper looks at acquisition into pharmaceutical companies, okay? The immediate reaction would be, but this acquisition must be good because most of these acquisitions are, the small biotech company, they have some great ideas, but they cannot be developed until the end of the pipeline. They need the capital of the big guys, okay? So what these guys do is say, hold on, let's look at the data. And they construct a very interesting data set with 38,000 of such pharmaceutical projects, so that's big enough to start looking into some empirical regularities. And what they find is that indeed, most of the time, 94% of the time, indeed, it's this kind of acquisition which is happening. The small guy, the small biotech is being purchased by a big guy, and then this pipeline goes until the end. There is a drug which goes into the market, and everybody is better off. That's great. But in 6% of the data set of Cunningham et al., they find killer acquisitions. So the small guys is bought by the big guy, and as soon as they're being bought, they are discontinued. And what's interesting is a couple of things. First of all, these discontinuation, they're being killed precisely when the small guy is doing research in the same therapeutical area as the big guy. So basically, they are killing potential competition before it emerges. The 6% is a super interesting number also. It's not as very small. Why? Take the intervention rates of the authorities. Okay? Take the European Commission. Every year, we look into about 400 to 500 mergers. Our intervention rate, and what do I mean by intervention rate? Intervention means either when you challenge a merger, and when you challenge a merger, you may ask for a divestiture, or you may block it. Actually, prohibiting a merger is a very low probability event, okay? Almost never you block a merger, but sometimes you do ask for a divestiture, okay? You ask for a remedy. Now, the intervention rate, intervention defined as within the whole pool of mergers, you look at what is when do you do something instead of just, it's 6%, okay? So in order, and since you don't know exactly which ones are the problematic mergers, it means that in order to pick the 6%, you have to look into all of them. In this sample, actually, none of those mergers, or virtually none of those mergers were, forget about challenge, but not even vetted by the competition authorities, okay? They're not even looked into, and I will tell you why. Interesting also, from another perspective, since there is lots of entrepreneurs here, I understand there is already people probably going to say, hold on, the small entrepreneur, he's investing because he wants to be bought, because that's the exit strategy they have. Fine, I'm not saying that this shouldn't happen. I'm simply saying that they should not be bought by the incumbent dominant companies in case they have totally overlapping capabilities, okay? They can be bought by someone else, okay? But that's just a clarification. Now, I'm not asking you to read through this slide. It's not meant to be readable. It's just to say, when it comes to big tech, what do we know? Well, this is not scientific, but there is a Wikipedia page dedicated to Alphabet, to the Google parent company. So what this is meant to say, there is a lot of acquisitions that actually Google made. This goes back to 2001, and there is 250 acquisitions. And this is basically every line would tell you the date, the company, if the acquisition price was eventually known, what kind of areas, whether they were integrated in the Google ecosystem or not, okay? No, this is one acquisition per month, every month in the past 18 years. Now, I'm not exactly sure what the US did. In Europe, we looked into one of these acquisitions. The last one was Google DoubleClick 12 years ago, 2007. So when I hear this debate between type 1 and type 2 errors, over-enforcing, under-enforcing, we looked into none. I'm not saying we should have blocked those, but at least looked into those, okay? This is sometimes when I'm a bit surprised that people stop even asking questions. Now we heard about Senator Warren, and she's already got answers to potential problems. But I think she's right, and at least in asking questions. And we should never, never, never lose our ability to ask questions before we come to answers. I may disagree with the answer she's actually giving, but asking questions is always very healthy. So none of those was actually even looked into, so forget blocking. 250 for Alphabet, there would be a smaller number, but still in the range of 100 and something for Facebook, for Microsoft, for Amazon. So what can we do? Proposals, discussion here, open to the floor. First of all, because we are in one of the greatest academic institutions of this country, I would love to have some independent academic doing exactly what the guys did for the pharma industry. Okay, let's look at this 250 plus 100 of Microsoft, the 100 of Facebook. What happened to those companies? What do we know? Okay, come up and study it because it's badly needed, and we also need independent academics to do that. There is too much advocacy into this industry, okay, which is not even disclosed most of the time. Second one, why have we not looked into those acquisitions? Why nothing in digital? Why nothing in pharma? Because at least from the European side, there is a problem with the way we define the thresholds for intervention. We have thresholds on intervention which depends on turnover, which is fine in traditional industries. Your size tomorrow, a good predictor is your turnover today, okay? That's fine if it is a traditional industry. However, if you base it on turnover in digital, these guys don't have turnover yet because they're betting. The business model may be free goods for the first few years. In a pharma, it takes time until you bring the drug to the market. So clearly there is a problem there in having thresholds which are based on turnover, and instead we should have thresholds which are based on the value of a transaction. As an economist, the value of a transaction has market information that we are completely missing. Plus, we can use the market information about the transaction value compared with financial evaluation methods to see whether that is plausible or whether this price is abnormal, strangely high, so it might actually include some preemption rents. Facebook bought WhatsApp for $19 billion. I mean, you start asking questions when you see those kind of figures. The third proposal is much more controversial. Greg said that in the 70s we had a sort of anti-competitive presumption for every merger, and we went away from it. We would block even a 10-to-9 merger. It would be presumed anti-competitive unless the companies could show some efficiencies. But I should also say that the pendulum has gone very, very far on the other side. Now we almost never challenge any merger until we get to a full monopoly. We basically challenge mergers to monopoly and a few others, okay? So maybe for some of these large companies, we should change a little bit the burden of proof. When it comes to super dominant firms and super dominant, okay, what we have to start a discussion about the definition, but I do have in mind companies with 75, 80% market shares, really dominant, is max in your face when you see it, change the presumption. So you are not gonna allow this company to acquire even minor companies unless they can really show there are complementarities, there are efficiencies, so you reverse the burden of proof. Let me skip this in the interest of time. The last point I want to make is very specific to advertising. Why? Because Google and Facebook, what they do is basically they make money from advertising. This year, jointly, they are going to make about $100 billion in advertising alone. So advertising is important, is very relevant, and advertising is also done in a way which is very much still 20th century, if I can quote something that was said earlier in the morning. So what do we do when it comes to some of these mergers? Take Facebook, Instagram. This was not even looked by the European Commission, but it was looked, I think, by the FTC in this country and by the Office of Fair Trading. That was the name of the competition authority in the UK at the time. How did they analyze it? They went for a definition of the relevant market, that's what you do in normal cases, And with this idea of finding the relevant market, they said the relevant market is going to be the market for online camera apps. Okay, that was the market definition. And then they said Instagram, well, but there's also Hipstamatic and some other stuff. We are not seeing a big problem in the market for camera apps. Online camera apps, and then of course they know these are multi-sided market. They would be looking on the other side of the market for advertisers. It would say, well, but you can reach consumers online in so many different ways, so there is not a problem in the advertising market either, and the merger was actually clear. Now, this seems to be, as I said, very 20th century, and not really what's going on in this real world. So my way of looking at it is that this is not a characterization of hyper-targeted advertising that we see in these markets. So Instagram is not, or this is not there in order to provide you an online camera app. They are there in order to learn about you. So my idea in these markets is to see many of these platforms as attention brokers. So the ultimate scarce resource in our economy is our time. What these platforms are doing, they're trying to get us online as much as possible, okay? Think about it. You know, they are cute, so they can do everything. And in order to keep us online as much as possible, because they learn about us. They learn about us, they can match information across the different apps they have, they can see what we like, what we write, what we read, what we, et cetera, et cetera. They can read through our emails, et cetera, in order to learn about us and then make hyper-targeted advertising to us. So this is very different from the old-fashioned view of advertising markets, which is the billboard analogy, the eyeballs analogy. In the past advertising markets, what would you do? You have a budget, you can put your money on the Financial Times, on CNN, on Fox News, whatever, knowing that you would get the average viewer of that channel, you would get the average reader of that newspaper, the average person passing by the street if it is a billboard, okay? But that would be the ad which would be shown to everybody. If now we ran an experiment and we looked into our Facebook pages, I don't know how many hundred people in this room we would have, say, 300 people, we would have 300 different ads that would be shown simultaneously to us. So what I'm saying is that if you look into this way, into these advertising markets, what matters is really which ones are the platforms that can grab our attention, and via the artificial intelligence and machine learning, they can get to know about us. First of all, ask about that. They can grab our attention, therefore do advertising personalized, these are individualized kind of markets, and the market definition becomes at the consumer level. It becomes at the consumer level, so what matters, say, in a merger example, is the following. If prior to a merger, imagine only Facebook and only Instagram had the ability to learn about me and Carl, say, okay? Because they are the only platforms that we patronize constantly, so they know our history, they know everything, so they would be able to do hyper-targeted advertising to each one of us. If prior to the merger, I was only on Instagram, say, and Carl was only on Facebook, and they merged, nothing changes because we were already monopoly bottlenecks prior to the merger. If instead we were spending 50% of our time on Facebook and 50% of our time on Instagram, and then there is a merger, before the advertiser could actually get to us in different ways. It could be competition for those lots of our attentions, but after the merger, this competition is eliminated and we become bottlenecks. So this is an idea that Tim Wu, which is a bit of a radical scholar in law at Columbia, has put forward with Andrea Prato, who's an economist, less radical, at also Columbia, and myself, we started putting those ideas to show that it is possible to use conventional economics tools if you are ready to depart from supply-side kind of metrics. It's not relevant to know that Facebook has 40% of the attention and Google has 20%. These are meaningless information. What matters is to know how much of my attention that they have. And we show in this paper with Andrea Pratt, for instance, that it is possible to use data servers, in some survey data, in order to precisely estimate these kind of effects. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you both. Just so the audience gets ready, I'm going to ask a few questions, but then turn it over to the audience relatively quickly after a couple of questions. So we talked a little bit about Elizabeth Warren's proposal, and in the words of people, elections matter. And the question for both, there's also not only our presidential election, but also in May, there's the EU Parliament election, which can affect a number of different things, including the makeup of DG Comp, where Tommaso works. And I'm thinking about the question of how much, if you're either side of the antitrust view that we need to increase enforcement, or I'm scared of increased enforcement, the question is how much discretion do the antitrust authorities have in the EU and the US to become much more aggressive or not? And how much will we need new laws in order to do that? And how might things change the burden of proof? Because the burden of proof is a pretty important piece in thinking about antitrust cases. Do you have to prove that it's in the public interest, or do you have to prove that it's not a bad thing? And those are very different standards of proof. So if you could each talk about sort of how the elections might matter, or what we need to do to change things.
So I'll go first. I think that the Justice Department and the Federal Trade Commission, being the two federal agencies in the US that do this, have a lot of discretion about how to enforce the antitrust laws. And personally, I think we should be considerably more aggressive on mergers, and I think case by case on the conduct, on the Sherman Act. But the courts, the Justice Department can't do anything except by going to court. Really, neither of them can do much without going to court. And the courts have been, for 40 years, cutting back. So there's discretion, but it's very limited by the courts. If the courts are not willing to do very much, and we all think somehow, let's say as a country, that we need to do more, then it's going to have to be legislation, which is a very heavy lift. You know, the Sherman Act's 120 years old. But the way that would happen in part would be by the FTC and DOJ bringing cases, trying their hardest, and seeing how it works. And there really is a historical significant difference between Republican and Democratic administrations in how they handle this, particularly on the conduct side and somewhat on the merger side.
From a European perspective, I think the challenge is going to be to preserve a system which more or less works okay. It's a different system in Europe. It's an administrative system, and then, of course, there are two different levels. You can go to the European Court of Justice, to the Supreme Court of Europe. But the challenge there, because we are in a moment of populism, is going to be to preserve this system from political influence and interference, which is not going to be easy. Probably this was not a big news in the US, but a few weeks ago we blocked a merger, which was in very high-speed trains, and it was a merger between Siemens, which is the #1 world producer of high-speed trains, a German firm, and Alstom, which is the #2 player in the world, which is a French firm. So perhaps you don't get to see those cases, but it's not that we have a bias against American firms. We also do stuff against European firms, but they are less visible here because you don't have high-speed trains in the US. These are trains that actually go up 220, 240 miles per hour, so real fast. It was a joke, but they're very fast. So and when this happened, you had the French Prime Minister and the German Chancellor that went very tough against the European Commission. So this is telling you about the beauty of European institutions, because we are less perhaps subject to political interference like you are in the US, because the European Commission is not represented any of the member states. It's a bit supranational, which is good. So I'm not appointed by the European president, right? So I'm much more of a technocrat in what I do in that sense. I'm much more independent in that sense. But also the fragility, especially now in the next parallel session, there will be one on Brexit with the exit, perhaps, of Britain. That means the very pragmatic view on competition policy that we always had from Britain, which was very useful, is going to miss. And therefore, this influence of Germany and France is going to become much more prevalent. And what they want to introduce now in Europe, where basically you have a merger, say, we have two phases. Either you clear or you challenge, phase 1 and phase 2. And they want to get a phase 3, where the phase 3 is some political veto, a veto power that countries retain to go against, instead of going to the courts, which is what it is, the politicians that would have a veto power, which is clearly not a good development in my view.
Let me just add, assuming Brexit does go forward, the UK has been really a moderating influence, from a US perspective at least, a moderating influence in pulling the the competition authorities there are more in the direction of what the US does, so we'll see a bigger gap, most likely, between Brussels and DC if Britain is no longer part of the EU.
Having said that, there is also, the UK is aware, of course, that they may have to go on their own, and the competition authority there has recently published a white paper saying that they want to become more stringent on mergers, and there is going to be Jason Furman, that was heading the Council of Economic Advisors here, which is also producing next Wednesday, next week, next week, they will make public a report for the Treasury, for the UK Treasury, and I understand that also they will be calling for tougher implication in the merger side, on the merger side.
So that's the UK. Just at the end of this month, Commissioner, I'm never going to say it right, Vestager expects a report on technology, the challenges of digitization for competition policy. And I wanted to ask you what you expect for this, but it turns out we also have a new development in technology on the US where the FTC has a new technology task force that it has also introduced. So the antitrust authorities are very interested in how high-tech industries will play and how these questions will come about. So I was wondering if both of you would comment on what you expect to see from these different reports and if there will be changes made as a result.
So again, I will give you my very honest view. The honest view is that we can always learn. That's great. The exercise is useful to learn about something. But these things take also a lot of time. So it's just a way to postpone. So I don't know if the FTC inquiry is when they're going to produce any results. My view, I'm very pragmatic also. I like to be hands-on, is let's run more cases and let's close them. It doesn't mean to run a case that you want to do something so that we learn about it. Okay. So what I was saying about programmatic advertising, about hyper-targeted advertising, unless you run a case, you're never going to learn it. And instead, we are a little bit in this negative loop where we say we cannot intervene because we don't have precedents, but we don't create precedents, and hence we won't intervene. And instead, I would like to open the box a bit more. Ask questions, open the box, and then we will get answers.
Well, it's way too early to tell you what this Federal Trade Commission Tech Task Force is going to come to. It may be nothing more than, internally they're going to put some resources in to focus on some of the big tech firms, given all the demand for that and arguably the need for it. But it's not going to change the fact that it takes a long time to build these cases for FTC or DOJ. It's hard in court, probably too hard. And I mean, even you go back to the Microsoft case of 20 years ago, a big case, and set an important precedent that was in favor of antitrust enforcement. But it's not like there were 5 other cases after that, or it changed. Did it really change the whole industry? I mean, okay, I think it was a good case. So we'll see what they're doing. But if you're expecting even an aggressive DOJ or FTC to significantly change the tech industry in the next few years, that seems pretty damn unlikely to me.
Okay, I have confusion because my watch and the clock changed. So we're okay with the 9 minutes? Okay, just wanted to check on that. So we have 9 minutes I'm going to go to the audience for questions and see where we go. So I saw there first. Of course, I picked someone right in the middle. Is there a microphone coming? I should have picked someone at the edge. I'm sorry.
I'll make it a short question. In an attempt to look a little less elite than we sometimes look here, since that's a hot button topic in the United States. Do either of you have any sense of what the populist demand is for actions with regards to these platforms? I'm not at all sure that many people say, man, I got to have Google broken up. They don't understand quite maybe what you're talking about. Just your thoughts.
Well, since I happen to have in front of me, I'm not normally a publicist for Elizabeth Warren, but this is the title of her posting it's dated today. It's on Medium, at least that's where I found it. It's time to break up Amazon, Google, and Facebook. So she's pretty detailed here about what she's proposing. I think it's a good voicing of, I don't know whether she'd want to call herself a populist or not, but where this direction goes, which is to unwind some acquisitions they've done, to break them up. She proposes a regulatory structure which is like, you remember the common carriers from telecom? Or if you're a common carrier, you have to treat everybody equally, and then at one time, like AT&T had line of business restrictions. They couldn't do certain things. Okay, so she basically wants the tech platforms, and she's including here Amazon, Facebook, Google, and I think Apple, not sure about Apple. If you have a platform and you're big enough, in terms of your, I think it's either sales or market cap, then you can't do other things. So it's line of business restrictions, regulation, so and sharply limiting acquisition. So in the tech area, I think that's a description of what this would be. By the way, I should say, it's still an answer. We can learn a lot from telecom regulation here about what we can and can't do and some of the difficulties of it, but that's where she's going.
Just forgive me, I wasn't asking about Elizabeth Warren, I was asking about people.
Yeah, I mean, if I can give you my take on it, it depends on the way you frame the question. So if you tell people you want to break up Google, which is giving you a great search for free, or do you want to break up Facebook, which is giving you a great social network for free, people would say, no, I don't. But if you start saying, are you aware that Google is making on average, I don't know, $150, $200 from every customer or something like this, do you think that's fair? People would say no, okay? So it depends a little bit how you frame the question. Where there is definitely demand, this probably is not for breaking up, this is technical stuff, but it's more on the privacy issue, okay? There is a big concern that privacy is an issue. It's an issue of consumer protection, it's an issue of competition. This is probably where I diverge also from Carl. And this is where Europe has taken some lead, maybe in the wrong way, but with the GDPR, so the General Data Protection Regulation that came into being last year, at least they put at the forefront that privacy is there. There is a right for data to become portable. You can ask companies to give you your data. It's not something against big companies. It's not something against digital company, because it's a principle that applies everywhere across the board to every firm of every size. Lots of things that have to be discussed because it's not clear whether pseudo-anonymized data are included or not. They also bring forward a principle, which is consent. Okay, what does it mean, consent? And they are saying, because they recognize there is this very asymmetric bargain between a tiny individual and the large companies, and they are saying quite explicitly that the punishment to the consumer that doesn't give consent cannot be disproportionate. What that means is a different matter. But we already see, for instance, that there are some national, because GDPR is enacted by national regulators, okay? It's not the European Commission. The German Data Protection Agency, the French, the Italian, et cetera, et cetera. And Germany recently came with an antitrust case against Facebook. I don't know if you're aware about it. They use German law. They didn't use European law. The German law says if you're a dominant company and you breach any other law, you are abusing your dominance, okay? That's the way it does. And they said, Facebook, you are basically sharing information across your platforms and with third parties without having asked consent, informed consent. You are in breach of GDPR, therefore that's an abuse of dominance. What's interesting in the German decision, whether you agree or not, it's been appealed, so we will see how it's going to evolve in the future, is that it's quite orthogonal to what the European Commission is doing in conduct cases. In conduct cases, we had Google Shopping, Android last year. Next month, we will go with AdSense, which is the last of the 3 Google cases that we have. Basically, the Commission is imposing eventually even big fines, $5 billion for Android. That probably hurts even Google, okay? But then we say, cease and desist, stop doing it. We don't say what the remedy should actually be. Apologies, this is falling apart. I am falling apart. Instead, the Germans said, we are not going to impose a fine because our powers are limited, we are never going to hurt you anyway, but we tell you exactly what we want, okay? What we want is that you cannot share data with third parties. You cannot share data across your ecosystem with Instagram and WhatsApp unless you get very explicit consent, very informed consent from the users about what you're going to do with the data. And if you don't get the consent, this would be the disproportionate thing. You cannot deny access to Facebook because you don't need this integration to give access to your fundamental product. Okay? That's what they said. At least they were very explicit and very bold in saying this is a world that we would like. Okay? Instead, the European Commission is much more. Okay, we tell you this is bad, do something, and we will see whether we like it or not, but we are not going to tell you what we think is appropriate. Instead, the Germans said, they're very Germans, of course. So the Germans said, we are going to tell you what is appropriate, and they've been very explicit, which is very brave, I think.
Let me answer. I think people are concerned about privacy and their data, and they're concerned about the impact of these companies on our society and a democracy, so they want transparency and oversight and governance in some way. Neither of those is particularly about competition, but that is what I think people want.
Okay, we have time for one more.
So you talked about the issues of privacy, of competition, of economic damage to the consumer and competitors and so forth. How does these platforms as the transmitter and arbiter of how people are served up information, for example, the election, is it a factor in these antitrust and competitive scenarios?
I'd say it's mostly not a factor, but it's something that people are concerned about because of their impact on our society, and that's why we need some other form of regulation that isn't about antitrust, at least as far as I'm concerned.
So I'm going to jump in for a second and say the FTC probably has more power to do something about this than the Department of Justice because the Federal Trade Commission also has consumer protection as part of its mandate in the U.S. And did you want to jump in, Tommaso?
Yes, just perhaps that's the different perspective that we have in Europe. When you have abuse of dominance, you can have different things. You can have leverage tying. This is the Microsoft case. But you can also have exploitative abuse. Okay? Exploitative abuse means typically that prices are too high, too high, and because you are abusing your monopoly power by extracting unfair deals. And this is going to be the frontier. So privacy becomes a competition problem if we believe that exploitative behavior is something that antitrust authorities should actually deal with.
And we don't do that in the U.S.
Great.
Okay. Well, thank you, Tommaso, Carl, and Greg.